word propaganda gets used a lot in criticism of media today over the last, 50 or 60 years, mostly in an incorrect or misapplied way, which is to say it gets used as criticism in itself rather than as a neutrally descriptive matter-of-fact term. From about the mid-20th to now 21st century, you mostly exclusively hear it applied in an accusatory fashion, i.e. this is propaganda, thus implying that the subject at hand both should not be propaganda and that propaganda itself is inherently negative. But for the majority of history, that wasn't always the case. Propaganda, which broadly defined, I imagine, most people do correctly understand to mean some form of art, literature, performance, presentation, etc., usually but not exclusively an over-the-top bombastic variety, explicitly putting forth a one-sided, agenda-driven narrative of support for a political movement, ideology, belief system, whatever. Marketing, but to convince you to invest moral or philosophical commitment rather than money. In the United States and Europe, most people's concept of propaganda in its base, most obvious form usually means our collective cultural memory of patriotic, morale-boosting advertising by both the Allies and Axis during World War II, mainly because this is our last time our culture generally remembers engaging in propaganda in the pure form, willingly and for the most part in full proud awareness that they were watching it and why. See, today we think of propaganda and being propagandized too as being interchangeable with gaslighting, subliminal advertising, or brainwashing because the immediate post-war era begat the Madison Avenue era of mass media advertising and the rise of omnipresent pseudo-self-aware style of, I'm affecting a self-conscious, obvious, smug tone in order to convey that we both know that this is an advertisement so that you'll feel I respect you even as I proceed to sell you something anyway therein. So as such, we imagine previous eras of message media consumers looking at earnest, unironic propagandist mythologizing of anything really as being simply less savvy than us, staring slack-jawed up at the bright lights and pretty colors and loud noises. The truth of the matter is, though, for the most part, Americans going to see wartime pick-me-ups like the Fighting Sullivans or Donald Duck in De Fuhre's face in World War II or the battleship Potemkin back in 1920s Russia or Germans going to see Triumph of the Will in the 30s for that matter, they knew and enthusiastically expected going in that they were the choir and this was going to preach to them. As it had for most of human history to that point, propaganda mostly meant pep rally. I'm already on the team, now charge me up and keep me cheering. But as noted a moment ago, post-World War II 1950s brought modernism, postmodernism, and self-referential irony, or at least a self-flattering, I can tell you're a customer of discernment, soror madam, version thereof, into being the dominant tone of American media voice, which meant that earnest, direct, you are the righteous good guys who backed the right side, and here's why propaganda appeal stopped holding cultural appeal outside the realms of juvenile fiction, sports, and specific performative rituals and religious holidays, the 4th of July and parades. As such, the concept of propaganda in popular culture quickly became associated exclusively with foreign cultures that we knew still practiced it without irony, chiefly propaganda materials produced by the Soviet Union, in particular the specific aesthetics of the Department of Agitation and Propaganda, or agitprop. You've seen this style? That's what it's called. And since the USSR and the Soviet bloc communism was the big boogeyman of the Cold War, agitprop on their end was seen as not simply old-fashioned and tacky, but inherently villainous, which had the side effect of rendering any attempt at direct tit-for-tat propaganda counter from the US side look, well, if not equally villainous, at least more Punisher than Captain America. And for the people actually tasked with quote-unquote fighting the Cold War on a non-guns and missiles front, that was a problem. From the perspective of US and democratic European intelligence operatives, the Soviet Union had a huge advantage in the soft power front of advancing their cause through the combination of agitprop and the mainstream popular arts because, even under Stalinism's increasingly oppressive shadow, Russia had a deep and long-standing connection to the grand traditions of respectable pan-European literature, theater, music, and cinema. It was only natural, for example, that the most powerful socialist country would dominate in an era when one of the sweeping art and literary trends was social and/or socialist realism. The center of concern on the pro-democracy side, then, was that the emerging post-war main power and champion in the form of the United States was not seen by anyone as a serious player in those fields. Oh sure, American culture was popular, but Coca-Cola, Norman Rockwell, Superman, and the Mickey Mouse Gang were not the cultural titans that were going to convince the generation of vibrant university-bound young minds of Europe, Asia, and Latin America, whose allegiance was believed to likely decide the outcome of the 20th century whether to pledge Team Eagle or Team Bear. And of course, a communist country had the advantage of being able to just order such state-mandated creative productions into being. Whereas the United States, where a generation later Mr. Rogers was going to have to go to Washington and make Congress cry just to keep PBS on the air, not so much. So, who handled this? The CIA, as it turned out. Yeah, once a closely guarded secret whispered and joked about in the halls of power, but now fairly well reported in books like Eric Bennett's The Workshops of Empire, Francis Stoner Saunders' Who Paid the Piper, The CIA and the Cultural Cold War, and Joe Whitney's Finks, How the CIA Tricked the World's Best Writers, and several others. For a good long stretch, the hot part of the early Cold War, there was a veritable gold rush of CIA programs wherein middlemen and women with strong anti-Soviet ideals and/or solid connections to the world of art, literature, and academia created false front operations, schmoozed billionaire donors who were really interested in keeping the United States from having a communist revolution of its own that would raise their taxes, and generally busted their asses covertly to essentially create American cutting-edge art and high-end literary movements that also felt organically pro-Western liberal democracy and ideology, essentially out of thin air. And the thing is, it worked. In fact, this might have been the most successful thing the CIA did during the Cold War, all things considered. By now, most people have heard about the moral and tactical disasters involved with, like, attempted coups in Latin America and Cuba, getting involved with the Shah in Iran, and Mujahideen in Afghanistan turning into the Taliban. I mean, it's kind of a crappy record, to be honest, but, like, as art promoters, music agents, and creative writing teachers, yeah, I mean, it sounds like I'm joking, because it's kind of funny, but they were actually really good at that. But okay, the agency's big success stories that we know of in this era of propaganda that wasn't were the Congress for Cultural Freedom and the FARFIELD Foundation. The CCF was a front organization operating in Europe and eventually the rest of the world that essentially allowed the CIA to funnel money and influence to dozens of different literary and art journals all over the continent to organize gallery shows, concerts, performances, and the like for American and democratic European artists and performers in order to show off the creative prowess of the quote-unquote free world. This was largely how the music of Leonard Bernstein, George Gershwin, the plays of Lillian Hellman, Eugene O'Neill, Tennessee Williams, Clifford Odette, John Steinbeck, the writings of Thurber, Alcott, Hemingway, Cousins, Sandburg, Faulkner, Woolf, and hundreds of others first found distribution outside the United States. Louis Armstrong, Duke Ellington, and Dizzy Gillespie were conscripted to personally tour as jazz ambassadors to demonstrate the uniquely American jazz form and U.S. racial progress, many, indeed most of those involved, never having been aware of any level of covert involvement in their endeavors. Now, the FARFIELD Foundation, on the other hand, is much closer to what people think of when they think spooky, vaguely sketchy, uncomfortable. Were they really allowed to do that without us knowing spycraft stuff, at least in the broad strokes, even if it was still mostly about money changing hands enough time before it gets to a place for there to be plausible deniability. FARFIELD was a way for the agency to pump money into American-made art and literature, which rather than having a patriotic or pro-democracy message, at least didn't have an explicit pro-communist or Soviet helpful message. See, this was the radical proposition at the time they were working with. If people weren't going to buy into propaganda outright, you don't fund propaganda. You just fund everything that's not the other guy's propaganda. FARFIELD's two most lasting legacies were agency ally Paul Engel's long tenure as the director of the incredibly influential Iowa Writers' Workshop, where he shaped it into a talent farm for Pulitzer-winning fiction writers and a national model for American creative writing courses, which many will contend is precisely why so much of the last 40 to 50 years of American popular fiction is so similar, and also adheres to a set of seemingly apolitical rules that nonetheless make writing a socialist or class-oriented story pretty difficult in context, like the maxim that good literature should place theme and metaphor in the subtext rather than the foreground text, leave interpretation largely to the reader, focus on, quote, sensations, not doctrines, experiences, not dogmas, memories, not philosophies, or, as you've more commonly heard it put, show, don't tell.
What? Wow!
Whoa.
Yeah, that's where that comes from. And that's why. It's also why this painting by Jackson Pollock is worth $200 million. Yeah, no, really, this is completely true. See, prior to and during World War II, the popular art scene in the United States was dominated by social realism. But especially once the Soviet Union and its satellites aggressively adopted the uniformity of socialist realist art and Soviet classical architecture as the official style of the Republic in the mid-1930s, abstract cubist and other non-realistic artists made their way westward and transformed Paris and New York into the core emergent art scenes for what became, among other things, modernism. I'm simplifying a lot of art history here because there's a lot of this. But the short version, the moment the CIA and the FARFIELD Foundation laid eyes on the work of Jackson Pollock, Mark Rothko, William de Kooning, etc., doing what was essentially the throwing paint around on the canvas version of freeform jazz, and recognized that this was literally as direct an opposite to socialist realism as you were going to get, since the Soviet model was all message, all form, all the time, and this was about formless abstraction of abstraction and was literally about nothing. They said, yeah, we need to dump all the money on whatever this is. And that led to lavish placement of the suddenly everywhere hot new style of art at the agency-connected billionaire Nelson Rockefeller's Museum of Modern Art in New York, and soon touring in massive demand around Europe, carrying with it, as the unseen benefactors had surely hoped, the revolutionary new cultural zeitgeist of artistic and literary thought, one that said the true artist should be free of politics, messages, and ideology, turned on and dropped out from the dreary philosophical wars of politicians, and seeking higher truths in pure aesthetic forms. A sort of ennui-driven, intellectualized rejection of giving a shit, basically, that's generally thought to have effectively blunted the cultural tide of Soviet philosophy among the post-war European left to some extent, did undeniably get a ton of really interesting artwork and artists out there regardless of why, and also undeniably bit the more conservative players among the CIA Cold Warriors who'd been nudging it all in the place right in the ass when it was re-exported back to the United States as the beatniks, so irony.
Not a great plan.
Given, everything that followed after that. Oh, and also by the mid-60s, newspapers like the New York Times started to, report on the CIA having done stuff like this, and they kind of had to, stop, mostly. But, yeah, all of that happened. What? And while I know some of it may have seemed a bit not entirely in the typical big picture wheelhouse, especially if you started watching mainly since the comeback, I hope some of you learned something weird and wild you didn't necessarily know before. And also, I know many of you are asking, so wait, does this kind of thing still happen? Whoa! So, as we left our thesis off last time, propaganda, as we generally think of it in the negative, or at least corny, sentimentalized, tacky sense, sort of ceased to exist as a meaningfully significant art form or weapon of the culture war in its own right, at least as far as mainstream grown-up entertainment was concerned, towards the middle peak of the Cold War, certainly in the West and especially in the United States, leading briefly to a short but noteworthy moment covered in some depth last time, wherein intelligence operatives turned to dumping money into everything from creative writing workshops to jazz tours to abstract expressionist modern art in order to create anti-Soviet counterweights. Now, that's not to say that outright propaganda movies, TV shows, books, etc. of the conventional sort stopped existing outright. There were examples, just not big organized efforts like Why We Fight documentaries of the 40s or the revisionist Stalin biopics that the Soviet Union was making at the same time.
Viva Stalin! Viva Stalin! Slava Armate Rossi! Long live Stalin!
Мира и счастья всем вам, друзья мои!
And they tended to be efforts of private citizens or organizations rather than the military or government agencies. For example, as far as anyone knows, nobody had to ask John Wayne to make The Green Berets in 1968, essentially the only big-scale pro-Vietnam War movie produced in the US during the war itself. He went to the government and offered to do it as a show of support because he supported it, and they said yes.
What will happen to me now?
You let me worry about that, Green Beret. You're what this is all about.
Back at home, my young wife waits.
Yeah, that movie really sucks, by the way, and I say that as someone who really likes a lot of John Wayne movies and doesn't pretend that he wasn't talented just because of his politics. But okay, here we are in the present, so the big question, we've got more entertainment, art, and media options than ever, the world is more confusing and geopolitically unstable than ever, people are more connected and thus think they're more informed and savvy than ever, but that really means that most of them are more gullible and vulnerable than ever, so does this stuff still happen?
Of course it does.
Does it still happen like it did in those times before, though? That's a little more complicated. Okay, so officially, the United States government does not have an official Department of Propaganda or Ministry of Information. What it does have are the Bureau of Public Affairs, which is basically a combination of the State Department's Press Liaison and Publicity Management Office and a public information hub for U.S. citizens traveling abroad, and the U.S. Agency for Global Media, which funds and oversees state-run, pro-U.S. and/or pro-democracy media outlets overseas, outside the United States, primarily in the Middle East and Asia, none of them particularly influential or well-known. It's mostly a sink for think tank money. But as for that whole culture war thing that the CIA and the FARFIELD Foundation and Nelson Rockefeller and all the guys we talked about last time were so damn concerned about in the last episode, I mean, up until the last decade and a half or so, it wouldn't really cross anyone's mind that the US would need to fight that anymore. As it turned out, the whole "you'll never dominate world culture if your chief exports are Mickey, Ronald, and Coca-Cola" assumption was way the hell off base. We won the shit out of the global culture wars with our plastic junk, so the last few decades, promoting American values abroad has pretty much meant letting American companies sell their extremely popular stuff. You like that cheeseburger? Uncle Sam says you're welcome. You like Mickey Mouse? We did Mickey Mouse. You like The Simpsons? That's us too. You like Mike? You're welcome. Looney Tunes? You're welcome. Coke? You're welcome. Elmo? You're welcome. Big movies? You're welcome. Friends? Yeah. Really? People outside the US were that into Friends? Well, okay, you're welcome. Do you want Joey? You can keep Joey. Now, a lot of people have a lot of theories about the relationship between government entities and corporate media, often fluctuating based on who is or isn't in power and how you define corporate media, and what this or that person thinks the bugbear of the moment is or isn't. But one of the reasons this part 2 isn't as, oh my god, revelatory as part 1 episode is that since we're dealing mainly in the present tense, I'm restricting this to things that are generally known to be taking place rather than theories, speculation, or conjecture. So, for example, is it interesting that right around the same time that environmentalists and climate scientists have become more openly comfortable saying that we gotta make big changes and sacrifices to save the planet, a big recurring theme in mass appeal movies has started to become bad guys who see themselves as altruistic environmentalists for whom big changes and sacrifices mean I'm gonna fucking kill like half the people because I'm crazy?
Overpopulation, pollution, war. The mass extinction we feared has already begun. And we are the cause. We are the infection.
Too many mouths, not enough to go around. And when we faced extinction, I offered a solution.
genocide.
But random, dispassionate fare to rich and poor alike. They called me a madman.
Yeah, that is interesting. Does it mean that I think that, like, the Illuminati cut a giant check to Disney and said, hey, so we need everyone to think Thanos next time they see Greta? No, that's stupid. But the confluence is interesting. That's not to say that the uncomfortable subject of the government and/or military or intelligence agencies or whoever else involving themselves with trying to keep a certain uniformity of message on brand is completely off the table. It's just exercised in a different, more precise, and some would argue more insidious way. Since this is getting a bit long, I'll cut to the chase. You know how TV shows aren't supposed to show real products most of the time because if people who make that product don't like the context it's shown in, they can, under certain circumstances, ask for it to be edited out at the show's expense, or on the flip side, it could damage the show's ability to leverage charging other brands for the privilege of product placement? Well, the reason that the more authentic a movie or TV show set in and around the US military is, the less critical of said military and/or foreign policy it's probably going to be, is because the Pentagon owns the unique trademarks to all the uniforms, insignias, and specific designs of all the war stuff, basically. And if you want to play with the real war stuff in your big budget action movie or get actual troops and crew to help with the equipment or even appear on camera, the military has to approve the script and the general tone of your film. And if they say no, and you can't or won't change something, you'll probably have to use different decommissioned weapons or shoot in another country that uses similar enough gear, which can be very expensive or make your movie look like shit. And this can be very arbitrary. Supposedly Independence Day didn't get to use real Air Force equipment solely because they left in the plot point about the Area 51 cover-up being a real thing, whereas the Transformers movies got the full support of the military because Michael Bay has a very good relationship with the Pentagon for various reasons in general, and because that franchise's morally questionable secret agent stuff was being done by a fictional extra-governmental entity. And this is true of basically any film you've seen that had any official production agreement with the US military, even if they didn't have also some kind of additional advertising campaign or whatever else. No, the Army didn't strictly speaking fund the production directly or give them money, but they did give them a discount, kinda. No, this doesn't generally result in grotesquely obvious message-mongering or subliminal inception like that Simpsons Navy episode.
Yvonne et Miage, they keep saying that. Wait, what was that? Uncle Sam? Let me play this backwards.
Join the Navy. Join the Navy.
But it is more about smaller details and things that don't get said, which start to add up in terms of cultural uniformity of subject and message. We've all seen movies that say war is hell, or anti-war films, or even films about certain soldiers or generals or policies who just aren't nice, but how many times have you seen a movie where the overriding theme is that the concept of militaries, or soldiering, or warfighting are themselves inherently bad, irrespective of your actual opinion of that position? Exactly. The current gold star champion of this is the Marvel Cinematic Universe. No one else comes close. Even before the Disney deal, Marvel Studios and the Pentagon have been nigh inseparable. One of the few instances where the Army wasn't involved was the first Avengers, because the Pentagon decided that the overall concept of S.H.I.E.L.D. and the World Security Council outranking the rest of the military itself was just not something they could hang with. But otherwise, Marvel has had a standing production agreement with the Department of Defense going all the way back to the first Iron Man, and continuing up to Captain Marvel doing official full-blown Women of the Air Force ads today. And you might be thinking, okay, but apart from that, the Marvel movies aren't particularly patriotic, excluding the one really obvious case, and to the degree that they are, it's much less patriotism for one country than for some shared global identity of a post-national Disney consumer citizenhood, maybe? And the films have often been thematically anti-war, anti-nationalist, anti-surveillance, anti-misogynist, anti-racist, which is true, but they also manage to be against ideas without necessarily gesturing at every version of them or the structures behind them. Like I said, I can't keep having these things go on too long, so if you want a real deep dive into all this, go read this fantastic series of articles at this link. But just in the broad strokes, the whole MCU leaps off from Tony Stark deciding that he has to be Iron Man because he hates both terrorists and himself for all the harm done by the weapons he made. I mean, okay, good start, Tony, growth is good, but you were over there to sell them to the US Army. What do you think they were using them for? Later, we learn his superhero tenure was preceded by Captain Marvel, aka Carol Danvers, who defects from the Kree Star Force after discovering that they are in fact not brave warrior heroes, but rather the colonial military arm of an imperial war machine, and she's been sent on missions against desperate indigenous refugees. In her outrage, she resigns her post and symbolically recommits to what she recalls as a more noble and just position of her previous life. the US Air Force. So, that's gonna be an awkward night on Google eventually, if nothing else. None of this is ideological critique, just so we're clear, merely observation, though one could posit that this situation being produced in such a way to so frequently be criticizing or even subverting fantasy metaphor versions of militarism or government overreach, while also taking place adjacent to the reality of the same, is not unrelated to persistent broader criticisms about the Marvel films so often being about a battle to restore status quo rather than people who aren't villains taking proactive forward momentum. Okay, I just looked at my word count and it's time to wrap this up. So what are we supposed to take from all of this? Well, I feel like this is where I'm supposed to have some kind of extra surprise twist meaning to all of it, but it's really just kind of the same point the show always has. There's more to the things we like or dislike, and it's always a good idea to know more about what you're watching, reading, playing, listening to, and how the content got to you, from who and why. Not in a cynical or reflexively skeptical, can't enjoy things way, but in a being an active participant even in your own passive activity way, so that you're an engaged player in your own consumption of media. That's how you get more out of what you watch, and it's also how you come to demand more of it in the first place. I'm Bob, and that's the big picture.